Hmm. The folder was sitting right there on the table beside my coffee cup, and I remember thinking, not yet. Wait for the right moment. Let him finish his little speech first. My son's business partner was standing at the front of the room with a champagne flute in his hand, smiling the way powerful men smile when they believe no one in the world can touch them. There were at least 200 people in that banquet hall. Investors, board members, journalists, my son's colleagues who had flown in from 3 different states, and me, a 63-year-old retired nurse from Dayton, Ohio, sitting at a table near the back in a blue dress I had bought on sale at Macy's. He looked right at me when he said it. Some of us, he said, swirling his glass slowly, built this company from vision, from sacrifice, from real business acumen. He paused just long enough for the silence to land. And some of us just showed up tonight because we happened to raise the man who signed the paperwork. The laughter that followed was polite, confused. A few people looked at their plates. My son, standing near the podium, went very still. I picked up my folder. I folded my hands on top of it, and I waited. My husband's name was Gerald, and he died on a Tuesday in March when my son was 4 years old. Gerald worked safety inspections for Harwick Industrial, a mid-sized manufacturing company outside of Dayton that made components for agricultural equipment. He was methodical, careful, the kind of man who triple-checked everything: the locks on the doors at night, the oil in the car every 3,000 miles, the expiration dates on the milk in the refrigerator. He used to say that the one thing you could never afford in his line of work was assumptions. He was 41 years old when he died inside a storage facility that should have been ventilated, but wasn't. The official report called it an accident, equipment malfunction, an isolated incident that no one could have predicted. I was 38 years old, standing in a hospital corridor, in shoes that were still muddy from the morning garden, holding my son against my hip while a doctor, whose name I cannot remember, told me my husband was gone. My son looked up at me and asked if Daddy was sleeping. I told him yes. I don't know why I said that. I think I just needed one more minute before the world changed completely. The man who had run Harwick Industrial for 22 years was named Douglas Mercer. I knew who he was. Gerald had talked about him. Not with hatred, not at first, but with the careful wariness of a man who understood who held the power in a room. Douglas Mercer was the kind of executive who sent fruit baskets at Christmas and remembered the names of employees' children at the company picnic, and who had also, Gerald told me once, signed off on a cost reduction initiative that had quietly eliminated several of the ventilation maintenance protocols at 3 of their facilities. Gerald had filed an internal report about it 8 weeks before he died. I found a copy of that report in a shoebox in our closet 2 months after the funeral, tucked underneath Gerald's old pay stubs and a birthday card I had given him the year we got married. I read it 3 times sitting on the bedroom floor. Then I put it back in the shoebox, and I put the shoebox on the highest shelf in the closet, and I went to make dinner for my 4-year-old son because that was what I had to do. I kept that report for 25 years. I moved it from Dayton to Columbus when I took the nursing position at Riverside. I moved it from Columbus to Raleigh when my son got into NC State. Every time I opened a new closet in a new house, I put that shoebox on the highest shelf. I was waiting. I just didn't know what I was waiting for yet. My son's name is Patrick, and he has Gerald's hands, wide across the knuckles, careful and deliberate in how they move. When he was small, he used to follow me around the kitchen asking questions about everything. Why does bread rise? Why is the sky different colors in the morning than at night? Why do some people get sick and others don't? I became a nurse partly because of those questions. Partly because, after Gerald died, I needed work that felt like it mattered in a way I could see with my own eyes. I worked double shifts for 9 years. I drove a car with a heating system that only worked on one side. I bought Patrick's school clothes at the end of season sales, and I told him they were special finds, and he believed me, and I hope he still doesn't know the difference. He was a serious child, quiet in the way that thoughtful people are quiet, always listening more than he spoke. He put himself through the last 2 years of his MBA by tutoring undergraduates on weekends. When he called to tell me he'd been offered a position at a startup in Charlotte called Meridian Partners, his voice had a tremor in it that he was trying to hold steady. I cried in the kitchen after we hung up, and then I made myself a cup of tea and said out loud to nobody, "We did it, Gerald." What I didn't know then was that Meridian Partners had a senior investor and board advisor named Douglas Mercer. I found out the same way I found out most things. Patrick mentioned a name casually, over the phone, the way you mention something you don't realize carries weight. "My partner Douglas is flying in for the quarterly review," he said. "Older guy, knows everybody in manufacturing finance, he's been great." I set down my cup of tea very carefully. "What's his last name?" I asked. "Mercer," Patrick said. "Douglas Mercer." "Why?" I told him I thought I might have met him at a conference years ago. I asked a few casual questions about where Mercer had built his career, about what companies he'd been involved with, and Patrick answered them without suspicion, because Patrick has always trusted me, and I have never given him a reason not to. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. I thought about telling him right then. I ran through it in my mind, how I would explain the report, the shoebox, the 25 years of silence. I thought about what it would cost Patrick to know that the man mentoring him had been responsible, directly or indirectly, for the safety failures that killed his father. I thought about what it would cost Patrick's career if he walked away from Meridian on principle at 31 years old with a mortgage and a future he had worked his entire life to build. And then I thought about what Gerald would have wanted. Gerald would have wanted the truth. Gerald would have wanted the right moment for it. I went to the closet, I took down the shoebox, and I started making calls. It took me 14 months. I want you to understand what 14 months looks like when you are doing it quietly, alone, in the evenings after your shifts at the clinic where I was still working part-time. It looks like phone calls to a labor attorney in Columbus who had handled industrial cases in the 90s. It looks like certified letters to the Ohio Bureau of Workers' Compensation requesting archived records from a case that most people had long since filed away and forgotten. It looks like a retired OSHA investigator named Carl who had worked Gerald's case and who, when I reached him at his home in Tucson, went very quiet on the phone and then said, "I always thought there was more to that one." Carl sent me documents. The labor attorney sent me documents. The labor attorney sent me documents. I obtained Gerald's original internal safety report through a public records request that took 6 months to process. I assembled everything into a folder, organized, dated, cross-referenced, the way Gerald would have done it. The whole time, I said nothing to Patrick. I watched him thrive. I watched him pour everything he had into building Meridian into something real. I went to Charlotte for Thanksgiving and I sat across the dinner table from Douglas Mercer at a restaurant Patrick had chosen because it was my favorite type of food. And Douglas Mercer shook my hand and said he'd heard so much about me and what a remarkable job I must have done raising such a fine young man. I said thank you. I looked him in the eyes. I smiled the way I had learned to smile in 25 years of working night shifts, pleasantly, without giving anything away. That was 7 months before the launch event. Meridian Partners went public in November. Patrick called it a soft launch, a formal celebration for investors and stakeholders, a chance to present the company's 5-year vision to the people who would decide its future. He asked me to come. He said it would mean everything to him to have me in the room. I booked my flight the same afternoon. I wore the blue dress because Gerald always said blue was my color. I brought the folder in a leather portfolio I had bought specifically for this purpose. I sat at my table near the back, and I watched my son stand at the front of the room looking more like his father than he ever had before. Steady, certain, full of a quiet kind of confidence that nobody hands you but that you build yourself, year by year, out of all the things that were hard. I was so proud of him, I could barely see straight. And then Douglas Mercer picked up his champagne flute and opened his mouth. He was good at it, I'll give him that. The way he positioned himself as the architect, the visionary, the man who had seen Patrick's potential before anyone else. The way he made Patrick sound like a fortunate discovery rather than a man who had earned every single thing in that room. And then the comment about me, delivered with a smile. wrapped in the kind of condescension that assumes no one will push back because the person being condescended to doesn't have the standing to do so. I heard a few people laugh. I heard one person near me stop laughing when they realized what had actually been said. I saw Patrick's jaw tighten from across the room. I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I have spent 30 years working in hospitals, and I have learned that calm carries further than loud. "I'm sorry to interrupt," I said, "but I think this is actually the right moment." The room turned toward me. Douglas Mercer turned toward me. His expression was patient, faintly amused, a man who expected a mildly embarrassing scene that he would handle gracefully. I opened the portfolio. "My name is Margaret Holt," I said. "I am Patrick's mother. I am also the widow of Gerald Holt, who was a safety inspector at Harwick Industrial in Dayton, Ohio. Gerald died in March of 1999 in a ventilation failure at one of Harwick's storage facilities." I paused. Douglas Mercer was the CEO of Harwick Industrial at the time. He had received an internal safety report filed by Gerald 8 weeks before Gerald's death, flagging the exact ventilation protocols that failed. The room was completely silent. "I have that report here," I said. "I also have the cost reduction directive that Mr. Mercer signed 11 weeks before my husband died, which specifically reduced the maintenance schedule for ventilation systems at 3 Harwick facilities. I have correspondence between Mr. Mercer and Harwick's legal team from the months following my husband's death, and I have a statement from a retired OSHA investigator who believes the original case findings were incomplete." Douglas Mercer had set down his champagne glass. "I'm not an attorney," I said. "I'm a nurse from Dayton who raised her son alone for 29 years, but I have had 25 years to be very thorough." I closed the portfolio. I looked at my son. Patrick was standing completely still. He was looking at me the way he had looked at me when he was 4 years old and asked if Daddy was sleeping, like he was waiting for me to tell him something true, whatever it cost. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner," I said. "I was trying to protect you. I know now that wasn't my decision to make alone. What happened next happened quickly and then slowly, the way those things do." 2 of the investors in the room asked Douglas Mercer directly whether he had anything to respond. He said he would need to speak with his attorney. He left before the dessert course. I learned later from Patrick that 3 of the 4 major investors requested a board review within 10 days of that evening. Patrick came to me that night in the hotel room I had booked 2 blocks from the venue. He knocked on the door at 11:30, and when I opened it, he looked like he hadn't slept since dinner, which he probably hadn't. He sat down on the end of the bed, and he was quiet for a long time. That was always how he processed things, sitting with them first, letting them settle before he spoke. Finally, he said, "Why didn't you tell me about Dad? About what really happened?" I sat down beside him. I told him the truth, all of it. The shoebox, the 14 months of calls and documents, and Carl in Tucson. The dinner at Thanksgiving where I had smiled across the table at Douglas Mercer and said nothing. I told him I had been afraid. Not of Mercer, not anymore, but of what the knowledge would do to Patrick before Patrick had built himself strong enough to carry it. Patrick said, "You should have let me decide that." "Yes," I said, "I know that now." He didn't say anything for another long moment. Then he reached over and covered my hand with those wide, careful hands that look exactly like his father's. "You did all of that alone," he said. "The whole thing." "Not alone," I said. "Carl helped, and the labor attorney, and your father, in his way, he filed that report. He knew what he was putting in writing. He knew what it meant." Patrick wiped his face with his free hand. He is not a man who cries easily, but his eyes were red at the edges. "He would have been so proud of you," I said. Patrick laughed, a short, rough sound. "Mom, he would have been proud of you." The legal process that followed was long, and I will not pretend it was simple. Gerald's case was 25 years old, and there were statutes and complications and moments where the labor attorney called me to say he wasn't sure how far they could take it. But there was a settlement, not a verdict, not a courtroom, but a formal acknowledgement and a settlement, and I will not share the amount because that is not why I did it. I did it because Gerald filed a report. because he saw something wrong and he named it, in writing, in the language of his profession, at significant personal risk. And then he died before anyone took it seriously. I did it because 25 years is too long for something true to stay in a shoebox on a high shelf. Douglas Mercer resigned from Meridian's board within 3 weeks of that evening. Patrick restructured the company's advisory team over the following months. He called me every Sunday through all of it, which was new. We had always spoken often, but something shifted after that night. He started calling on Sunday mornings before I went to church, and we talked about everything. The company, the weather in Charlotte, what I was planting in the garden that spring, what his father had been like before Patrick was old enough to remember. I told him about Gerald as a young man, how he had proposed in the parking lot of a Dairy Queen because he had meant to do it somewhere nicer and then couldn't wait any longer. How he used to read the newspaper out loud over breakfast, asking my opinion on things he had already formed a view about because he liked to hear me disagree with him. How he had cried, openly and without embarrassment, the morning Patrick was born. Patrick listened to all of it like a man receiving something he had waited a long time for, which I suppose he was. There is a photograph on my mantle now. It's from the launch event. Someone at the venue took it, I think one of the wait staff with a phone, and Patrick found it afterward and had it printed and framed and mailed to me without telling me it was coming. In the photograph I am standing, folder open, looking across the room. I am 63 years old in a blue Macy's dress, and I am not looking at Douglas Mercer. I am looking at my son. Patrick says I look like I knew exactly what I was doing. I did. I had known for 25 years. Beside that photograph, I keep a copy of Gerald's internal safety report. Not the original, which is with the attorney, but a copy. The paper is new, but the words are Gerald's, careful and precise. The language of a man who checked everything twice because he understood what happened when people didn't. My son asks me sometimes if I have any regrets about how I handled it, about the long silence, about the years I waited. I tell him the truth. I regret that Gerald never got to see what Patrick became. I regret that Patrick grew up without his father's voice in the room to answer all those questions he had as a small boy. Why does bread rise? Why is the sky different colors in the morning? I do not regret the folder. I do not regret the waiting. I do not regret standing up in that banquet hall in my blue dress, calm as I have ever been in my life, and saying, this is actually the right moment. Because it was. Some things take 25 years to become the right moment, but they get there.